Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen Sinclair, and on behalf of the Heart of Iowa Den's communications team, I'd like to thank you for being with us tonight or at some point in the future. For those of you watching the recording later, we are excited to welcome you to this 4-part series on climate change, this first of which focuses on issues of water. We'll first hear presentations from each of the three, followed by a free-flowing conversation, if you will, on what's happening in the water in Iowa and the devastating effects of those actions here and elsewhere. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. You can view a transcript of this conversation by selecting live transcription in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We are live streaming this event on the Heart of Iowa Dem's Facebook page. You can check the chat for that link should you want to invite anyone in last minute. And we will also post the recording on our YouTube channel by the same name tomorrow and email you links for both. If you've got a question, drop it in the chat room, click the chat button in the toolbar, and each of the panelists will be speaking on aspects of water quality and links to climate change. And then Silvia will be facilitating conversation and will weave questions from the participants into the panelist conversation. Now I'd like to introduce the forum participants for this evening. Silvia Secchi is a geographer and sustainability sciences professor at the University of Iowa. Her work focuses on the interface between agriculture and the environment, particularly water and carbon. You may already be familiar with the water-focused podcast she co-hosts called We All Want Clean Water. Mahmud Fitil is a water protector who works through the Indigenous-led organization Great Plains Action Society, among others, on a range of projects relating to climate protections, including the construction of carbon pipelines, which he'll speak more about tonight. And Alicia Vasto is the water program director at the Iowa Environmental Council, taking point on projects focusing on clean water, land stewardship, and climate resiliency. Okay, I'll bow out and let Alicia take over with her presentation. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you, Jen, and thank you all for having me this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Okay. All right, and then I'll go into presenter mode. Okay. Can you all see? Does that look right?
Yes.
All right. Great. All right. So like Jen said, I'm Alicia Vasto. I'm the water program director at the Iowa Environmental Council. For those of you who aren't familiar with the council, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We work on law and policy issues related to water, land, climate, and energy here in Iowa. And we do that through coalition building. Our organization is made up of over 100 other member organizations, including other businesses and other nonprofits that work on the same issues as us. So we do a lot to work within our coalition to raise awareness and advocate for science-based policy solutions. So I'm going to talk with you tonight about Iowa's water quality crisis and what we really see as the imbalance of interest here in our state. So as many of you know, I'm sure, Iowa used to be a landscape dominated by prairie and wetlands. And in the last 2 centuries, that landscape has really been transformed to predominantly production agriculture. So Iowa has about 35 million acres in the state. 26 million acres of those are row cropped for primarily corn and soybeans. So this has been a really dramatic transformation. Some would say that we are the most altered landscape in the world. And this is really apparent in everything that we do related to the environment and to policy. So one of the things that I like to kind of bring up is this the kind of culture that we have here is very, production agriculture focused, and it is completely saturating the ecosystem here. And so this is, the Iowa Corn Growers website. They say corn, it's everything. Obviously, we think it'd be more appropriate and more accurate to say water, it's everything. And even on the Corn Growers website, they say that, in fact, corn is not everything. It primarily goes to ethanol production. And then the other majority of it goes towards livestock feed, and very little of it is used to actually feed the world. So, you know, these are the kind of messages that we get inundated with and that we are constantly trying to battle against in terms of trying to, you know, prioritize and raise up issues of environmental protection and water quality. Agriculture has always had primacy here in our state. And that is realized on the landscape by this really heavy degradation. There's very little policy or regulations around agricultural production because it is so heavily prioritized here. So we often see, you know, bare soils throughout the majority of the year. We see a lot of tile lines that are draining the water from those fields and piping them directly into streams. And we see heavy erosion and farming all the way up to stream banks, to the very edge and even into the stream bank. So, you know, this is the kind of outcomes that we see in the most extreme circumstances of a highly industrialized agricultural system. We also have an explosion of concentrated animal feeding operations here in Iowa. Our regulations have really made this a haven for livestock operations. So we have many, many more than any other state in the nation. And this means that there's a lot of manure that is being produced by these livestock that is being applied to our farm fields as fertilizer. And so our current regulations have been so tilted towards this production agriculture that there is nearly automatic approval of siting of these facilities. The state legislature has taken away local control or input on the siting of these operations, and there's no special protections for sensitive landscapes or drinking water sources. These operations are really given pretty much free rein to do what they want here in Iowa. And so what does that all lead to? Well, it leads to a water quality crisis that we have here. So we have just the most water quality issues that we have in our state are related to agricultural production. So we have nutrients from fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus, that are leaving our farm fields and ending up in our waterways. We have bacteria, including E. coli and other pathogens, and then we have a lot of sediment. And, you know, the majority of pollution mitigation for agriculture is voluntary. There are very few regulations. I know most of it is related to conservation compliance. If you are, you know, participating in a federal conservation program, you have some things that you have to do to prevent erosion. But otherwise, there are no regulations out there. And then we know that climate change is exacerbating all of these outcomes by concentrating pollutants and creating a positive cycle of, you know, carbon intensive and heavy industrial agriculture, requiring more inputs to help keep production at a high level. And then there's these extreme inequalities between who is creating the pollution and then who is paying for its removal down the road. And so we're seeing these consequences both in health problems and also financial costs, you know, trying to treat our water to make it actually drinkable here in the state. We also have harmful algae blooms that are caused by excess nutrients, those fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus, that go into our waterways. We have these algae blooms in the summer that can create toxins that can be really harmful to human health. And climate change is also exacerbating these. There's research that shows that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more heat and drier weather can lead to more harmful algae blooms. So this is definitely a major concern and something that we're really paying attention to here at the Iowa Environmental Council. It's also a major threat to drinking water. So microcystin is really, you just can't drink it, and it's difficult to treat for it. And there was a situation in Toledo in 2014 where they had to go on a bottled water advisory because they found microcystin in their finished drinking water. Their drinking water source is Lake Erie. And so we have a kind of a similar, potentially a similar situation here in Iowa or in Des Moines, where we have Saylorville Lake just upstream of our drinking water. And they're often plagued with algae blooms up there at Saylorville, and that microcystin, if it's in the water, they can't use the Des Moines River as a drinking water source. So, we really got close to this 2 years ago when there was a serious drought situation that was keeping the Raccoon River levels really low, and then microcystin in the Des Moines River. They were having to put out water use restrictions because of this kind of coalescence of these issues, which is really driven by climate change. And so what we see is this really huge imbalance of the public rights and agricultural production. So we're seeing all of these negative outcomes from unmitigated agricultural production. And those impacts are affecting regular, folks, taxpayers, drinking water ratepayers, recreationists who want to go and swim in the waterways. And we just really believe that this is just an unfair situation. Typically when you have a polluter, most other industries, there's a polluter pays model where they have to regulate their pollution and prevent it from reaching people, and they have regulated discharges. Well, in agriculture, they are really exempted from having to do any of that. So the solution to rebalancing these interests is through law and policy, and that's primarily what we work on at IEC. So we would really like to see a balance created between the environment, public health, quality of life, other kinds of economies, different communities across the state, as well as agriculture. And then we would see some of these beneficial outcomes. Iowa could really be a leader in a new farm economy and rural revitalization if we were able to adopt some policies to help set the stage for that. So instead of just, relying on voluntary compliance or adoption of conservation practices, we really need policy that's going to help move that forward and require certain things on the ground, because voluntary is just not moving fast enough. So these are some of the law and policy solutions that we talk about at the Iowa Environmental Council. I don't have time to get into all of them, but we have publications related to these on our website that I'd encourage you to check out. And I'm also happy to talk about further in the Q&A session. And then just to plug getting involved with our organization, you can visit us at iaenvironment.org and learn more and sign up and try to get involved in advocacy. We really focus on trying to alert people when there are actions to be taken, comments to be made, ways that you can use your voice to push for policies that are really going to benefit water quality and the environment here in Iowa. So please, if you're interested, check us out, and I will stop sharing there. Thank you.
Well, I think I am going to go next then, and I'm going to share my screen. And what I would like to talk about today is essentially what we can learn from our water quality situation, which Alicia has clearly outlined for us, that applies to climate. Why is this important? For one thing, a lot of the practices of our agricultural system that cause water problems also cause greenhouse gas emissions. And the policies that we're using, the tools that we're using, are largely the same. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed uses the same approach for climate change mitigation in agriculture that we're using in water quality, with the results that Alicia illustrated. But also the messaging and the kind of communication strategy is the same. So this is coming from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, which is our main policy tool in Iowa, driven by the feds pushing the state to do something about it. And this is how we measure progress. We look at inputs. We look at how humans participation. We look at acres of practices. And so if you look at specifically their inputs, look at the human side, they count the number of meetings, they count the cost share acres, they count mapping. I find fascinating how they measure the water side. They don't tell you whether the water is better or not. They tell you that we have monitoring in place. So this is the kind of messaging, right? Look at all the things we're doing. And they make it very difficult to look at whether actually the water is getting better, which is the whole point, right? Keep your eyes on the ball, because this is really a game of hiding the ball from the public. So the nutrient reduction strategy progress report doesn't tell you anything about phosphorus, one of the two nutrients. And to find information about nitrogen, you have to go from table 1 to table 13 to see if there is progress and kind of like put it together yourself. So this kind of strategy that is based on looking at inputs rather than outcomes, results in the environment, and omitting a large portion of the problem is what is happening in climate change as well. And this is one of the big portions of the problem that we are omitting. So between 1974 and 2017, we have doubled the number of pigs. This is the inventory. So at any one point in time in Iowa, we have now we have over 23 million pigs, right? And that number has doubled. At the same time, we have reduced the number of operations by an order of magnitude. And in fact, if you do the math, it's even more than that. But the nutrient reduction strategy doesn't mention CAFOs, not even once. So what we're doing with all these policies for water is what we're also set to do for all these policies on climate. Look at the number of biodigesters, look at the number of cover crops, while CAFO proliferation continues, okay? And so hogs are a really good example of this. We're the biggest hog producer in the country, but eggs to some extent are even worse, because Iowa is also the biggest egg producer in the United States. And we pretty much produce 15% of American eggs in 29 facilities in Iowa. Besides the fact that it's a health hazard, it's an avian flu, dream, you can imagine all the poop that is generated by these operations and the levels of waste. Okay, so, but again, when we think about water, we count the acres of cover crops, we count the wetlands. Well, this is not a problem that, 3 wetlands or 30 wetlands or 300 wetlands a year is going to solve, especially if it keeps increasing. Okay, so again, this is the communication strategy of the industry and the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, IDLES, the Ag Department, and Iowa State, which is one of the 3 kind of like main in the leadership of the strategy. They completely ignore the fact that on the negative side of the ledger, things are getting worse. And they just look at the marginal improvements we've been making. So this is going to be a problem as we devote more resources, and there were billions of dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act that went to existing voluntary programs, the same programs, in fact, that we use for water quality, because we don't have a way to really measure whether we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And agriculture is a big greenhouse gas emission emitter. Don't let people in the industry tell you otherwise. They say, oh, we only cause 10% of the US emissions. Yes, but we also, in agriculture, US agriculture is also only responsible for 0.6% of the US economy and employs 1.4% of the people. So the disproportionality is huge here, and it's because agriculture is not regulated in any way whatsoever. And these emissions are coming from both soil management, so the tillage practices, it's coming from manure management, it's coming from artificial fertilizers, it's coming from ruminants, it's coming from swine manure. So it's the whole system that's responsible for it. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing marginal changes in practices being sold as the solution. Just as they say, a couple more wetlands will solve the water quality problems. And they're now saying, oh, we just need to have cover crops and no-till. And the problem is that these practices are very dubious from a scientific perspective. There's a lot of discussion as to whether cover crops and no-till actually sequester carbon. Both of them are not permanent, which means when you stop the payments, the farmers will most likely till and cease using the cover crops. Also, USDA is just looking at carbon in the soil, but what about all those fertilizer applications? Or what about all those machinery passes? What about the drying of the corn post-harvest? We're not looking at any of those things. So these practices are not at the level they need to be to really address the problem. Similarly, the other big solution that's being touted, and people want to put subsidies in the farm bill for these biodigesters, biodigesters will likely cause a CAFO expansion. And we already have seen that CAFO expansion. I showed you that table with the hogs, right? Well, if we make it more profitable to produce hogs or dairy in CAFOs, we're going to see an expansion of those. These biodigesters don't do anything to address the pollution generated to grow the feed for these animals, and only capture part of the emissions from the livestock, right? The burps will still happen. And last but not least, in Iowa in particular, we don't have the monitoring capacity to address these systems that are typically very, very fiddly. Those 18,000 cows that burned to death last week, well, it was because they had a biodigester on site. Here in Iowa, we had that case 2 years ago of somebody who died, a contractor who died trying to fix a biodigester. And OSHA is not even doing anything about it because he was a contractor. So those are not solution in any way whatsoever. And the pipelines, well, we're going to hear more about the pipelines next, are not a system level solution because corn ethanol, besides generating a bunch of greenhouse gas emissions, also causes massive water quality problems. As you can see here, it causes soil erosion and it destroys habitat. It is, in fact, a complement and not a substitute for gasoline. So all these solutions that are being sold to us are as ineffective as the solutions that had been sold to us via the nutrient reduction strategy. So my message to you is we cannot soil health, oh, just look at the cover crops, or tech fix, oh, we need better technology for the biodigesters, fix our way out of this. This is a systemic problem that requires systemic changes, and we are going to be awash in greenwashing money with the IRA money, these climate smart partnerships that are, they're dominating the news. People are saying that this is a solution when they, in fact, are just ways to stall, just as in the case of water quality, and not generate any solutions. So I have a question slide, but I am going to reserve that for the last part of this conversation. And I'm going to have Mahmud take over from here.
Thank you, Silvia. من Mahmud Fitil, من كرم تطاروا يعني تطاروا من Uzvatanga Salamla. My name is Mahmud Fitil. I'm Ghanaian Tatar. I'm the Line Defense Director for Great Plains Action Society here in Iowa, operating throughout the Great Plains region. We're working on several things regarding the water quality here in the state of Iowa. Our executive director, Sakawas Novus, has been working on this for years and published a zine out, regarding or describing Iowa as a land that's most biologically altered in the United States. It was a highly coveted land, and there was much sought after fertile soils here between the, the land between the two rivers. Subsequently, those two rivers are playing a major impact, on the local climate and the ecology. And we see that even, downstream, people are being greatly affected by our activities here in Iowa and Nebraska and so on. We heard a lot of the discussion earlier from the previous two presenters regarding the water quality issues we're facing here in the state of Iowa. And many of the surface waterways are, in such a horrible condition that we cannot get in them to recreate or otherwise. There's issues with brain-eating amoebas, issues with, E. coli and various other bacterial issues in terms of the petroagrochemical issues that, places like Des Moines are having to operate two water treatment facilities to counter. And we see a lot of the, similar systemic or institutional issues that were mentioned by Silvia. Primarily, the fact that the government subsidizes farming with a farmer's insurance, giving a perverse incentive for people to plant in floodplains and to plant right up to the side of, streams and creeks and rivers and things of that nature. We see also, that we're still out here countering a lot of greenwashing that's going on in the state of Iowa and throughout the region. We see, our local state energy monopoly, Mid-American, is recently proposed dumping coal ash leachate discharge into the Missouri River. There's already issues with sediment erosion, all of the nitrates and phosphate and things like that are in the river, as well as the animal effluent that's going downstream and affecting people. It's said that the state of Iowa is contributing, between 60 and 80% to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. We're certainly not being good neighbors in that regard to people downstream with some of our industrial agricultural practices here. Nor are we to ourselves, or other sentient beings here in the state, or the rivers themselves. We actually are advocating as an Indigenous-led organization for rights of the rivers, both the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. We're going to be having a Quad Cities Mississippi River Summit coming up here later in the spring, which we'll be convening and discussing some environmental impacts here, both locally as well as affecting people along the river. Rivers and, our environments and ecologies do not recognize the colonial borders established here. And, that's something that's important to take into consideration when we face some climate change. We're looking at, as well, a number of these CO2 pipelines or CCS pipelines that are being proposed for the state of Iowa. I believe it's up to 3 now that we're facing. And, Summit, Navigator, and Wolf. Again, these are greenwash climate solutions. As mentioned earlier, the detrimental effect of discharging, coal ash leachate into the Missouri River, is a direct result of Mid-American greenwashing its operations by building all the wind turbine technology along 80 and touting Iowa is developing and producing more wind energy than states like Colorado. So they're greenwashing their operations because they also refuse to, properly shut down and transfer their operations from, fossil fuel dirty energy production into the, more sustainable and clean energy production that we all see exhibited, right here in our state being produced on a daily basis. The CO2 pipelines, Summit, Navigator, and Wolf ADM line are also false greenwash climate solutions. They're looking to build out a private infrastructure project using public dollars. And in that regard, it's also a technology that was developed by the fossil fuel industry in the late 60s and 70s to complement a process known as enhanced oil recovery. So in that regard, they're kind of monetizing on so-called carbon scrubbing, or it's almost like a recycling of carbon. They're going to continue extracting hydrocarbons and petroleum products and fossil fuels and burning it and creating CO2, but then they hope to be capturing it and then sequestering that. And it seems like another instance of the classical like rat race. We're not actually solving any kind of issue. We're not addressing climate change. We're not going to be reducing carbon in any meaningful way. And as such, we stand against false solutions like this because we simply don't have the time to wait. If you'll recall, back in 2019, as a direct impact of climate change, we faced massive flooding here throughout the region. Certainly Iowa is impacted, Nebraska, South Dakota. And, that presents its own safety concerns, and it's happening more frequently where we have, massive deluges after long periods of dry spells. And, that contributes to the erosion issues as well, which are affecting the poor water quality here exhibited in the state. So there are a number of things that we're trying to counter at the same time, but the climate change and the flooding, it creates another risk with the pipelines because these are hazardous liquid wastes that are being transported throughout our communities. And, in many cases, vulnerable communities such as sovereign nations along the Missouri River, the Winnebago and Omaha nations specifically, as well as, urban centers, where a lot of people and stakeholders are being ignored currently because the IUB focus has been primarily on landowners and real folks, for the part of eminent domain argument in the courts. So, there's a lot of people being impacted. And, we have certain concerns that we're shortchanging our future generations by engaging in such greenwash projects like this. We, as Indigenous people, stand, with the future generations and the other sentient beings, the rivers and the streams, and things like that, in order to promote a more equitable future for everyone. We need to realize that it's way past time for us to change a lot of our agricultural practices that are contributing to erosion. We need to change some of our petroagrochemical application practices. We need to be ending the usage of fossil fuels and keeping that in the ground, and transferring and subsidizing renewables in the way that we have traditionally done so for fossil fuels in order to speed up a more just transition. This is basically our stance and what we're working towards here. We face a lot of issues in an Indigenous-led organization, particularly related to the resource extraction industry. We have a director up in Sioux City that does a lot of work regarding the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives crisis epidemic, which is facing the local communities in very high numbers. We have some of the largest numbers throughout the United States. In the corridor between Council Bluffs and Sioux Falls, South Dakota, along I-29 there. So, it's all connected in that way as well. As we've heard the previous two speakers mention, we have a lot of social issues that are arising, as well as, issues regarding our systems and institutions failing us and providing for perverse incentive, which is, creating people investing in false solutions and wasting time and, ultimately extending the lifeline to the fossil fuel industry. We see also enablement of our energy monopoly to try to pollute the waterway further. And this is all something we're standing against as well today, currently in Iowa. So I don't want to take more time. I'm sure that we'll have the question section coming right further, and I believe I'll pass it back to Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmud. So one of the questions that came in that I think we all have different perspectives on, and so I think it's going to be interesting to see how each of us responds to that, is what can we do as voters to improve climate policy outcomes for our state? And I would say that you're already doing something by being here today. From my perspective, I'm not an advocate, right? I'm a professor at the university, but I think setting the stage for the correct narrative, for having all the facts out there is the first step. And we have a lot of, I subscribe to the Des Moines Register, and every time they have, or every other time I read the letters to the editor, I get very upset because they have a lot of what in my family we call propaganda. They have these people, just say things that are just not true. And so I think it's important to write letters to the editor to counter the narrative in your workplace, in your school, and to vote for people who counter that narrative. We have to be honest that the Democratic Party has not been incredibly brave, let's put it that way, when it comes to some of these issues related to agriculture problems. See the pipelines, for example. So I think it's important to counter the narrative and kind of like put all the facts out there, particularly in cases like the pipeline, where we have entry points, where we have new coalitions forming, new opportunities for people to reassess the system that we're living in. And, we're not feeding the world. More than half of Iowa's corn is going into ethanol. That's not feeding the world. Farmers are not stewards of the land because the land is eroded and the water is polluted and the air stinks. So all these stories that we get told don't reflect reality. So for me, it's necessary. I see it as part of my job as an employee of the state of Iowa to counter that narrative. So I'm curious to hear what Alicia and Mahmud's take on this question is.
Yeah, I think, one of the difficult things about climate change and environmental issues in general is making it a priority. There's always so much, there's so many issues, there's so much going on, there's so many attacks happening to pay attention to. And I think, if you really care about the environment and climate change, I think just talking to your elected officials about that and telling them, I want to see action on these things, and this is a priority for me. I think there's the airspace is always just filled with, there's just so many issues, and a lot of them really need addressing as well. But we are facing an existential crisis with climate change, and it's not getting the amount of attention that it deserves. And so I think if voters can, try to talk to their elected officials about that issue and say, that this is something that should be a priority, then I think that would help. And then, like Silvia is saying, talking more about these issues, getting it in front of other people, writing letters to the editor, talking with your friends and family about it, and trying to share real information that is based in science is really important to try to counter all of those narratives that we're hearing, and that, oh, we don't have to worry about this stuff, like someone is working on it. No, we need to worry about it. We need to talk about it, and we need to make it a priority.
I agree. I believe that, we just have to be persistent and tenacious in engaging our elected officials and holding them accountable for the type of Iowa that we want to live in. We see right now that, last legislative session, they put some bill together to sort of curtail or amend the loophole in eminent domain, which was directed towards the CCS pipeline project. And we saw that, that was ultimately tabled and they didn't make it out of the funnel, particularly by efforts from the governor. We started out this current legislative session. We had 5 different bills introduced, and then they had a House bill, come out of discussions when the other 5 didn't go anywhere. And it had wide bipartisan support as well. Again, the Republicans can't get through even a hallmark issue or a hallmark part of their plank, private property concerns, because of the perverse incentive of money in politics here. Certain actors like Bruce Rostoller, who is heavily involved in CAFOs and heavily involved in the ethanol industry, and now trying to propose a carbon sequestering pipeline when he's never operated any type of pipeline previously. You know, are just reckless profiteers that are trying to, you know, externalize their risks onto the public. And, you know, we need to have proper citizen oversight and engage our politicians. And if they're not working for us, we need to get them out. And I understand that, you know, we can do our best, and it's hard in an environment that we find ourselves in. But that's why I say we've got to remain tenacious and persistent with those that we do get elected.
So thank you both. We had two sets of questions that also came in. One set was related to drinking water, which I think is an issue that has a lot of environmental justice implications and is also impacted by climate change, and in fact, getting worse because now we have PFAS in our water, and what are we going to do about it? So in terms of our drinking water, I'll pick both of your brains, but my 2 cents is that there is some money coming from the feds for infrastructure. Hopefully we're not going to send it back. And it's really, this is a really big, massive problem. Somebody, I think it was Jen who put the paper that Alicia and I wrote a while back. It's a real big problem in rural Iowa in particular. And so, you know, my 2 cents is these alliances that are being forged regarding the pipelines could be forged regarding drinking water too, because Republicans drink water as much as Democrats. And the lack of good drinking water is a problem for everyone in Iowa. Again, we need to make sure that people understand and appreciate the extent of it. But maybe this time Mahmud can go first in addressing this kind of question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the importance of drinking water is key. That's part of our opposition to the pipelines, as well as the sequestration. We've seen the Iowa Geological Survey try to weigh in and probably for funding reasons advocate to sequester the carbon locally here, you know, which would be a jeopardy for a lot of rural folks who rely on well water for their needs. There's an issue of leaching the heavy metals into the water, as well as, you know, an acidification of the water should the carbon shift around. We see that, you know, there's so much going on. It's like people are being bombarded, and it's really hard to maintain focus sometimes on certain issues. No sooner do you sort of wrap one up or come to some okay compromise, then there's some other 2 or 3 that pop up on the radar. As we've heard several people mention, you know, there's always going to be another pipeline or some other issue going on. We see that here in the state of Iowa, for example, they don't count, you know, pregnant sow or piglet in the head count for how many hogs there is, and, you know, and other kind of things that are really leaving an impact on the local ecology. We see the impact of ethanol production, as mentioned earlier by Silvia. I believe that 60% of the annual crop is going to non-consumable means. You know, they're using it for producing fuel. We're growing fuel at a huge ecological cost. You know, with all the added inputs to the waterways here, we can't use our water, and you know, it's costing even more. It's becoming preventative and costing for the men, and they're really trying to question if they're going to maintain or be able to maintain the 2 filtration plants. So we see that it's affecting everybody across the state. Rural people, it's impacting Indigenous communities in Sioux City and urban areas, as well as reservations along the river. And I'm not sure what we can do, you know, besides maintaining a presence, you know, engaging where we can, and staying informed.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, there's been more attention on drinking water as an issue in the last few years because of, you know, the crisis in Flint, the situation in Toledo, these pipelines that are really threatening drinking water sources. sorry. And then also in the more recent past, the droughts that we've seen across the country, water quantity as an issue that compounds issues with water quality. We've seen that even here in Iowa. And I think that, we've always been a place where we really take for granted the ability to turn on the tap and have clean water come out. And I think that, since we've seen some drought and we've seen threats from water pollution, alongside that people are thinking about drinking water access more seriously, which is good and important. And yeah, hopefully, the federal funding that will come to help support infrastructure improvements, which are really desperately needed. There has not been enough investment in infrastructure for drinking water and wastewater or stormwater over the last 50 some years, plus years, I guess. So, hopefully some of those things can be assessed and fixed, but we also, are really facing challenges with water quantity when it comes to climate change. And I think in ways that we weren't really expecting. When we talk about climate change here, we've often been really focused on flooding. And then with the drought in the last few years, that really puts a finer point on the need to be adaptive and accounting for all of these extremes. There was, I think it was 2 years ago, one of the rural water systems up in Northwest Iowa, they said that, they were running so low they were drawing from an aquifer. They were running so low on water that they couldn't hook up another livestock operation to their water system because those livestock operations are so water intensive. So, it's getting to situations like that where we, are counting the amount of water that we have. And so I think it's good to be having the conversation, but it's unfortunate that we're in this position.
Thank you both. And so the last kind of like set of questions that came in were related to ethanol and why does Iowa put so much energy into ethanol production, and the pipelines are clearly part of this. And again, my 2 cents are that Iowa had some of the best agricultural land before ethanol, and the disappearance of ethanol is not going to cause the untimely demise of Iowa's agriculture. So again, it's a tactic. It's a PR campaign, right? Just like if you remember when we started building ethanol plants, we were promised tens of thousands of jobs that never materialized. So the ethanol industry is not that big piece of the Iowa economy that people make it out to be. And ethanol will disappear with the internal combustion engine. It is a complement to gasoline. So to pretend otherwise, again, it's a false narrative that people who just want to get short-term benefits on the public dime and on the back of private landowners are really overselling. So I think, Iowa certainly, and more than neighboring states, but the rest of the Corn Belt, they would like to keep growing corn for ethanol, but we can grow other things like we used to do before. And, it was just as well. This idea that if we don't grow corn, the economy will collapse is just not true. We don't have to grow this much corn, and the corn we grow doesn't have to be used for ethanol. So I think it's really, really important to change that narrative. Any thoughts from you folks? And we have like a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, I would just quickly say, I think we're really missing out on an opportunity by not talking about the future of farming that is already naturally moving away from ethanol. Like, we're really holding on to this as, the prime purpose of farming in our state, when really we're going to be leaving farmers behind as the economy naturally moves more towards electric vehicles. So why aren't we doing more to try to help make that transition into a more diverse farming economy of the future that is really going to help support farmers and also help support local rural communities and also be better for the environment. I think that, we really need some leadership on this issue, because it is going to happen whether we keep our claws dug into ethanol for as long as we possibly can. It would be much better to be taking a more proactive and thoughtful approach to the transition.
Yeah, I agree that we need to stay off of ethanol, and it was intended to be a bridge fill. We need to go ahead and let it phase out as it was intended. We've identified through working on CCS pipeline work nationally, a close link to some things like California low carbon fuel standard, and we've been working with those people to kind of explain and highlight, the ecological damage locally to us and then downstream to folks in the Gulf. It's unfortunate that people are buying that type of propaganda so readily, and we do see a lot of the landowners and other people coming forward and detailing that we can grow other things and we don't have to be committed to ethanol. And unfortunately, if they do get the CCS pipelines passed in, that unfortunately will lock in ethanol for much longer than it was intended. And it will continue to, wreak more havoc on our local ecology. But I'm optimistic. We have a very unlikely coalition of very different people across the political spectrum and social spectrum, for that matter, engaged in these arguments, because we all need to drink clean water.
Well, this was a very good, place where to stop, because I am hopeful too. And I do think that people are thinking more critically about the issues that we have brought up tonight. And I believe we are exactly on time to have Jen take over and close things off.
Wow, thank you so much, all three of you. Once again, I'd like to thank Alicia Vasto, Silvia Secchi, Mahmud Fitil, for sharing with us this evening. That was such a generative conversation. And I really look forward to seeing how more involvement and action stems from it. Also, a big thank you to those who are helping behind the scenes tonight: Kieran Patel, Kathy Focht, Suzanne Kavish, and Sarah Smith. A reminder that the recording of this event is available on the Heart of Iowa Facebook page, and it will be up on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Kathy Focht will send an email tomorrow too with the links that were in the chat tonight. And if you haven't yet and you want to, you can sign up for the next 3 sessions in this Earth to Iowa series at heartofiowadens.com/register. Next Wednesday, April 26th, we'll focus on air pollution, then soil quality on May 3rd, and then finally on May 10th, the effects of climate change on food and animals, with, again, public health weaving its way through all of them. So we'll drop that Zoom registration link in the chat again. It is heartofiowadens.com/register. And that is it from us. Good night. And thank you so much for attending and for keeping this series going.